Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
You get frustrated with media. I know. You share those thoughts with me all the time. I do too. I especially go crazy when I see people writing and saying, oh, you know, the media just doesn't know how to cover Donald Trump. It's only been 9 years, folks. It's only been 9 years. One voice that we used to have was Margaret Sullivan. She was somebody who was front-facing, direct-facing with the readers that read the various publications that she has been involved with, including the New York Times. Most of those organizations no longer have this sort of position. And man, oh man, if there was ever a time when we needed it, it seems like now. Margaret Sullivan continues to write about these things, to talk about these things, and to be a voice for sanity in what seems like an ever crazier media landscape. She joins us now to talk about this. Thank you so much, Margaret, for being here.
Well, thank you, Joan, very much for having me. I'm excited to talk to listeners in Chicagoland, where I went to graduate school at Medill at Northwestern. So I feel like it's a little bit of a hometown for me, too.
Yes, absolutely, even though we know that you've gone to Columbia University in New York, yes, where you're the executive director of the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism, Ethics, and Security.
Yes, it's kind of a mouthful, but that is what I'm doing right now. And I also write for The Guardian.
Yes.
And I write on Substack. So I'm still doing the work in various different ways.
Well, as long as we're tooting your horn, let's get the book into Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy. It does feel like a crisis in American democracy, partially because of what is going on in the world of politics, but also because of the way the mainstream media seems to be reporting this election and how much they are treating these two candidates like they're two sides of a coin. Like, well, you know, like I don't know who got this term popularized in the media, but sane washing. I see so much sane washing, taking the insanity, the craziness, the hate and the vitriol that is Donald Trump and boiling it down to make it sound like an actual logical idea. Well, Trump says this, but Kamala says this. Yeah, but Trump says a lot of other stuff, too. I know that you have been really, really critical, particularly of headline writers. Talk to us about that.
Well, you know, a lot of people don't get past the headline, and that's understandable because we're all very busy and we're scanning the news and we're seeing what comes up on our phone or wherever we may be taking it in. So headlines really, really matter. And what I've been noticing is that the headlines about Trump in particular do that thing that you were just talking about. They do that sane washing. So it's kind of a combination of whitewashing and making things sound sane that aren't. And also something that could be called false equivalency. Taking, kind of a traditional candidate like Kamala Harris, who's, she's basically a democracy candidate, and Trump, who very much is signaling that he will be an autocrat. He's even said, I'll be a dictator on day one, wants to call out the troops to go after his rivals. And they make these headlines in particular make the candidates seem pretty much the same. That Trump, when he's talking about how undocumented migrants or migrants who happen to commit a crime are animals, it's described as, he's got an interest in because he says, that they have bad blood or bad genes and that it's, kind of infiltrating America. This is portrayed as his deep interest in genes and genetics. That's just not really what's going on.
One of the things that drives me insane is exactly what you're talking about, this equivalence. And sometimes people text me and they attribute this kind of stuff to the fact that a lot of mainstream media has big-time corporate ownership, and, corporations don't want to anger Donald Trump. But I don't know if it's that. I can't understand. I know there are people, let me use my favorite whipping boy, the New York Times. I know there are people at the New York Times who really see this election in very stark terms. We've had a couple of very blunt editorials from the editorial board, and yet the rest of the New York Times seems to be one of the most guilty parties with sane washing and whataboutism. Even before this, when Biden was president, it would be something like, best job numbers in a decade, but there would always be a but. Best job numbers in a decade, but will it last? But can Biden sustain it? But will Biden mess it up?
Best job numbers in a decade. Why this is bad for Joe Biden?
Yes.
Crazy stuff. I think that you are onto something when you talk about corporate ownership, and not necessarily because they don't want to anger Donald Trump. I think it's a little bit, that may be part of it, but I think a lot of it is that, news organizations want to have the biggest possible audience, and they do not want to rule out or anger or completely dismiss these 70 million people who support Donald Trump. So I think that's a part of it. And there's also this idea of, not wanting to look like you're favoring any particular candidate. That's a very strong built-in feeling in the news media. Like, we want to be neutral. And there's an understandable and even a good reason for that. You want to be unbiased and nonpartisan and fair. But when you've got such a stark difference in these candidates and such frightening stuff coming out of Trump, I think you have to be bolder about pointing it out and not worried about who you're going to alienate when you do it.
Okay, so why aren't we seeing that? I agree with you. And to me, it's obvious.
Yeah, again, I think it is because they don't want to anger or to alienate a big portion of the country, because they're trying to have a big tent, the biggest possible number of customers, basically. So it's a couple of different things. It's that, which is a commercial interest, and there's also this long-held feeling that we need to be fair, we need to be neutral, we need to be nonpartisan. And so this is why you get this false balance, or this false equivalency, that basically treats two different candidates, they couldn't be much more different, as if they're more or less the same, more or less like two traditional candidates.
You've been behind the scenes at various high-profile, big-deal newspapers. Mm-hmm. What are the discussions like in the newsroom? Are there discussions, or is it just we know what to do because we know what the unspoken rules are? Do they have these debates? Like, I think they do. But, Joan, you mentioned leading into when you brought me on that I used to have a role at the New York Times, and the role was called public editor. And it basically was an ombudsman, so that the readers would write to me and I could take their complaints to the higher-ups and get some answers and then feed that back to the public. And those positions, as you mentioned, have really gone away at the New York Times, gone away at the Washington Post, and there are very few of them. Only really National Public Radio and PBS still have them. And I think that while those voices do exist in the newsroom, they get kind of drowned out by these other things. And, the politics reporters and editors are really the ones who, they're very deep into their own sense of what we need to do. And Jay Rosen, who's a professor at NYU, talks about the savvy style. You want to sound sort of savvy and smarter than the public. And so you have this kind of almost a cynical approach to it, which is not, in my mind, not in keeping with the mission, the true mission of journalism, which is to inform the public so that we can do our jobs so that the public can do its job of, voting, really knowing who to vote for, going to the voting booth and making wise decisions. Did they get rid of these positions to save money, or just because you were an annoying voice that they didn't want to hear anymore?
Well, I mean, I think the reason that different news organizations have gotten rid of their public editors or ombudsmen was partly cost savings, but I think it's partly that they really don't love the criticism. When the Times got rid of its public editor job, and I was gone by then, so I had moved on to a different kind of job at the Washington Post. I was a columnist, not a public editor. So it was after I left that they got rid of it, and at the time they said, well, why should we have someone on our staff who's doing this critiquing when there's Twitter, there's the whole world of, would-be media critics out there. Why do we need to have someone on staff to do it? But the difference is, well, for one thing, they don't pay attention to the criticism on Twitter or on social media. But the other part of it that I think is so different is that the public editor had the responsibility and the wherewithal to go to the top editors and say, hey, what's up? Why did you do this? Mm-hmm. And they really had to give you an answer. And then you would give the answers back to the public right in the same publication. So it was very powerful to do it that way. I mean, I think that it's, media people can be very defensive. Nobody likes criticism. And this was a way to, have less of that. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, that public editor job also functioned as kind of a steam valve. It allowed some of the anger out, and it made people feel like, well, maybe I can't change things, but at least someone's hearing me. And I think it's a real loss that those jobs have gone away. I really, and I think it would improve the quality of the journalism if they still existed, but I do not expect them to come back.
Margaret Sullivan is going to hang on while we take a break for news. And, we're doing our media segment today. Margaret, we do these monthly or even bi-monthly segments with Jennifer Schulze and Mark Jacob, where we critique how reporters are doing their job. Margaret, Mark, and Jennifer have all connected and retweeted each other on social media. So when we come back, I'm going to let the three famous people talk, and I'll just, jump in as needed, if indeed I'm needed at all. We'll be back with more right after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I am very happy to welcome back to our program Margaret Sullivan, used to be the ombudsman at the New York Times. She is now at the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism, Ethics, and Security at Columbia University. She also writes for The Guardian. And, of course, I am going to welcome back the two people you know and love, longtime newswoman, TV newswoman Jennifer Schulze, and longtime Trib and Sun-Times editor Mark Jacob, who also writes a newsletter called Stop the Presses. Welcome, everybody. Now, you guys have interacted on social media with Margaret, so I'm going to let you start off with your questions for her or what you want to talk with her about. Jennifer, why don't you start?
Oh, this is so exciting. Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Joan.
Hi.
I'm very excited to be talking with all of you, but I'm totally depressed about the topic, I have to be honest. Which, of course, the topic is, as it always is when Mark and I are on the radio together, what has the media done today that made us mad? Or
it's a never-ending supply of talk, Margaret.
Or tomorrow, or last week. Anyway, I guess my question for Margaret, who I have so much respect for and read everything that she writes and have for years, is is this really as bad as it feels with some of the legacy media coverage or lack thereof? I feel I just don't know if other people feel as upset about it as I do. I think maybe they do, and I'm just curious, Margaret, where do you put it in your long career in journalism? Are we at some kind of weird place we've never been before, at least in modern times, with the way the news is and isn't covering somebody like Trump?
Yeah. Hi, Jennifer. So, and Mark, I really like both of. I like your work so much, so it's great to be on the show with you. I think that because Trump is so unusual and so dangerous, we know this, and yet the media, the big media, like the Times, the Washington Post, and lots of others, they just haven't sort of caught up with it in their coverage. So they're not exactly doing completely old-style reporting, but they haven't nearly made the adjustments that they should have made. I mean, we're really not acting, when I say we, the media, is not acting too different than it did when Trump was running in 2015 and 2016. There hasn't been a huge adjustment. I mean, I think there's been, there's more calling out of his lies. There's probably more fact-checking now. But in terms of a major adjustment, like really being able to get the point across to the general public that this is a very dangerous figure and here's what it means, I don't think we're doing that. So it is a real frustration and it is a real worry. And it bothers me. It bothers me a lot. At the same time, I also know that, and I know you guys know this too, the Times does a lot of great work. The Washington Post does a lot of great work. So do many others. It's one of the reasons we know as much as we do about Trump and those who he would bring to the forefront is because of stories and coverage in those news organizations. So it's, I don't see it as all bad, but I think that the tone of the politics coverage is really off. So I'd like to know what you guys are feeling about that today. And Mark, you're always so incisive. Where's your head on this now?
Well, I have a question for you, Margaret. So I get, whenever I post on social media criticism of the New York Times, Washington Post, you name it, I mean, I think I'm being fair, and I criticize them. And people will comment on my post and they'll say, yeah, the news media is out to get Trump elected. It's all a big conspiracy. I don't think it's a big conspiracy. I was an editor in a major newspaper for years, and I used to laugh when people said that we had some conspiracy. I was saying we're not organized well enough to conspire. We couldn't get a good conspiracy going because it's a complicated, chaotic job being in a newsroom and trying to produce paper. So I don't ascribe evil motives to these people, but I want to ask you about that. What is the mindset that makes them unable to adjust to this new threat, this constant lying, and being unable to fend off this lying or confront it?
Yeah, I think that the reason, everybody always asks me, why haven't they changed? What's the reason? I think the reason there are a couple of related things. One is there's a very strong feeling, and at the Times it comes right from the top. We need to be independent. That's the magic word. Well, independence is being interpreted as kind of even Steven. Like taking things sort of down the middle, treating Trump the same way that Harris is treated. But they're such different candidates. They're such different people. The futures that they will bring are so different that it doesn't make sense to treat them equally. And then I think so there's that whole, we've got to be independent, nonpartisan, all of that, which at its core is proper and a great idea. It's just that it doesn't work when you have a near autocrat and a demagogue on one side of the aisle. And then I think the other part of it is a business related thing, which is we want to have a big tent. We want everybody included. We are not willing to alienate 70 million Americans or the politicians on the right. We want everybody because that benefits us from a business perspective. That's my take on it.
You know what bothers me about that? I mean, lots of things bother me about it, but what bothers me is that presumes, if you're the New York Times or the Washington Post, that you are applying some standards equally. And I think we could all agree that we do not see that happening. It seems to me that on a regular basis, now Harris, but before that Biden, are being held to a higher standard, a different standard on all kinds of things that Trump is not. And I feel like that's reflected in the news coverage every single day. And I mean, honestly, at this point, I hate to say it, but I'd settle for the same standard as opposed to no standard and a really high, unreachable standard. I mean, that's what it feels like every day when I look at the news.
Right. It's like no matter what Trump does, no matter what he says, if he says call out the troops on Election Day, which he said yesterday, it's sort of shrugged off. It's like, well, okay. If Harris said or did any of these things, it would be a huge, huge story. So I think you're right, and I agree with you. I mean, the standards are different. So in that sense, yeah, we'd sort of welcome some equivalency, that there isn't kind of equal treatment. I think the news media has given up on trying to hold Trump to any standard. So you're right about that. Absolutely.
I think that's what we see too, is that they've thrown in the towel, hence the sane washing. You know, it's just Trump being Trump. It's just Trump being Trump.
Well, but Joan,
I think it's worse than sane washing, though. I mean, look at the headlines about the Coachella speech. Trump went to California. What? He went to California? Really? That's the story? Are you kidding me?
Right.
I mean, that happens every day. That's something crazy. That's a almost willful ignorance of what he's actually saying and doing and the import of it, which is, I think, fairly consistent now, especially during this campaign. And that I do not understand that.
Well, don't you think that
it's very hard to understand why it would be portrayed that way? It's absolutely weird.
I like that. Weird. Guys, Margaret has to go. She can only hang with us till 4:15, and we've almost pushed her past that already.
Well, invite her back. Invite her back. We want to do this again. We didn't have enough time to talk to our friend Margaret.
Well, I'd like to just mention that I'm doing an event in Chicago this weekend at the University of Chicago's Logan Center for the Arts, and it's open to the public. It's at 4:00. You could find it online if you look. My name, Margaret Sullivan, and Election 2024. You have to register, but it should be really interesting, and I'm hoping some of your listeners would consider coming out.
It's at the Riva and David Logan Center for the Arts. That's 915 East 60th Street in Chicago this Saturday from 4 to 6. Margaret, obviously you are welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
Love to have these discussions.
I love your guests. These are people who are being really smart about the media, and I only wish that we could feel like we were getting somewhere. But maybe it's valuable in some way. I hope it is.
I hope so, too. Margaret Sullivan, she writes for The Guardian, and she is a director of the Center for Journalism, Ethics, and Security at Columbia University.